The Salvation Mission Hall in Cleveland, Ohio had never witnessed a night like this. It was meant to be just another town hall, one more stop on Donald Trump's speaking tour, another gathering where he would shake hands, answer policy questions, and remind people why he believed in America. The room was packed, filled to the brim with struggling families seeking hope, war veterans who carried their burdens in silence, and small business owners clinging to dreams that seemed harder to hold on to. The scent of worn wooden pews and fresh coffee from the volunteer table lingered in the air, mixing with the low hum of quiet conversation. It was the kind of atmosphere that had become routine, predictable, structured, the same as the dozens of town halls before it, until a single voice changed everything. "Mr. Trump, does God care about people like me?" The words sliced through the room like a blade. The murmur of the crowd ceased. A heavy stillness settled over the hall, the kind of silence that didn't just come from an absence of sound, but from the collective breath of hundreds of people waiting, listening. All eyes turned toward the speaker. Standing near the aisle, gripping the back of a folding chair with small, trembling fingers, was a boy. He couldn't have been older than 10. His clothes were clean but threadbare, the fabric soft and faded from too many washes. His sneakers, slightly oversized, bore scuff marks from shoes that had walked too far, passed down too many times. His name was Jacob, and Jacob had no parents. The town's mission shelter had taken him in, given him food, a bed, and a place to sleep. But no shelter, no meal, no kindness from strangers could fill the emptiness inside him. Too many nights he had lain awake in the dark, whispering a question into the quiet, one that had gone unanswered for as long as he could remember. And tonight, in front of hundreds of people, he asked it. "Does God care about people like me?" The weight of it pressed down on the room, thick and unshakable. Even Trump, a man known for his quick wit and sharp responses, did not answer right away. Instead, he simply looked at the boy, and in that moment, something in his expression changed. For a man who had answered a million questions in his lifetime, this one was different. The audience leaned forward. Some exchanged glances, others swallowed down the tightness in their throats. Trump took a slow breath. "That's a big question." His voice, normally brimming with confidence and force, was softer now. Jacob's grip tightened on the chair, his knuckles pale. "I just want to know." Trump's gaze lingered on the boy, his posture still. And then, for the first time that night, he stepped away from the podium. The hall, already quiet, seemed to freeze in time. He walked toward Jacob. His voice, normally brimming with confidence and force, was softer now. Jacob's grip tightened on the chair, his knuckles pale. "I just want to know." Trump's gaze lingered on the boy, his posture still. And then, for the first time that night, he stepped away from the podium. The hall, already quiet, seemed to freeze in time. He walked toward Jacob. A hush spread through the hall, pressing against the walls, filling the space between every breath. No one shifted, no one whispered, no one so much as moved. Trump's voice, usually powerful and commanding, had softened into something quieter, something raw. "When I was young," he continued, "my father told me that faith is like climbing a ladder. Step by step, even when it's hard, even when you don't know where it leads, you keep climbing." Jacob's lip quivered. His small frame, already delicate, already fragile, seemed even smaller under the weight of so many eyes, so much expectation. Trump held his gaze unwavering. "But I'll be honest with you," he said, his voice steady but quiet, his words carrying the kind of weight that only came from lived experience. "There were times in my life when I stopped climbing, when I thought God wasn't listening to me, when I wondered if he even cared." The air itself seemed to tighten. The audience, people who had come expecting a speech, expecting policy, expecting the usual fight, were met instead with something real. They hadn't expected this. "Truth." Trump exhaled, shaking his head slightly, as if remembering something long buried. "I've lost people. I've failed at things. I've had nights where I sat alone and wondered, why me? Why now? Why does this hurt so much?" He paused. "And you know what? I never got an easy answer." The weight of those words hung heavy in the room. And then he looked Jacob in the eye. A moment passed, a long, deep moment. But I know this. His voice, though quiet, carried strength, certainty. Every time I thought I was alone, every time I thought I'd lost everything, somehow, some way, I got back up. A pause. And I didn't do that alone. The audience leaned in, their emotions wound tight like a rope around the moment. Tears glistened in the corners of more than a few eyes. A veteran near the front clenched his jaw, his hands folded over his cane. A single mother in the back held her child closer. A businessman, once skeptical, swallowed hard, staring at the stage with something new in his expression. Trump straightened. His voice, gaining strength now, filled the room. So, do I believe God cares about people like you? The boy's hands trembled slightly as he wiped at his nose. Trump's voice rose, stronger now, weighted with conviction. Jacob, I think God cares about you more than you could ever imagine. A single tear slipped down Jacob's cheek. The boy's eyes, big, dark, and full of years of silent questions, welled up. And in that instant, the room felt it before it even heard it. The shift, the truth settling into the space between them. Some people covered their mouths. Others pressed their hands against their chests as if trying to hold something inside that had suddenly become too much. Jacob sniffled. His voice, barely more than a whisper, cracked through the silence. Even if I don't have a family. Trump did something then that no one had expected. He knelt down, right there, in front of everyone. At that moment, there was no stage, no cameras, no politics, just a man and a boy. Especially then, Trump said. The words landed like a thunderclap of truth. Jacob's breath hitched. His little hands curled into the sleeves of his too big jacket. He looked away for a second, struggling against something too big to hold back. Then, he looked back at Trump. How do you know? Trump didn't hesitate. He placed a hand on Jacob's small shoulder, steady and warm. Because you're here. Silence. Then, a sob from somewhere in the crowd. Then another. And then, finally, applause. But it wasn't the kind of applause meant for rallies. It wasn't loud and aggressive. Wasn't just noise for the sake of noise. It was raw. It was real. It was deep. Jacob wiped his nose against his sleeve. He tried to say something, but his voice broke. Trump gave a small smile. That's all right, kid. Some answer. The clapping grew louder. A woman near the front reached for her husband's hand. A young father holding his daughter pressed a kiss to the top of her head. A veteran bowed his head, whispering something too quiet to hear. At the very back, an elderly man wiped at his eyes with the back of his sleeve. And then, Trump stood, faced the crowd once more. And when he spoke, his voice, though steady, was different, changed. Tonight, this kid reminded me of something. Faith isn't about knowing everything. It's about believing in something bigger than yourself, even when it's hard. The words hung in the air for a moment, stretching across the vast hall, sinking into the spaces between breaths, between thoughts, between the questions people hadn't even realized they carried. Then, the crowd roared. The sound surged forward like a wave, rising, swelling, crashing into the very walls of the mission hall. People clapped, some cheered, others simply nodded, silent but moved, their faces reflecting something deeper than agreement, understanding. But Jacob didn't seem to hear them. The noise blurred, faded, became something distant, unimportant. His small hands rested in his lap, his fingers tracing the frayed edge of his shirt, feeling the worn fabric beneath his touch. His chest rose and fell in slow, steady breaths, his eyes fixed downward, lost in thought. For the first time in a long time, he felt something he hadn't felt before. Hope, a warmth that didn't come from charity or kind words or the brief comfort of a hot meal. This was different. This was real. A feeling that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't alone after all. Trump turned back to him, his expression softer, his voice carrying none of the usual bravado, none of the performance that came with public speaking. You're going to be just fine, kid. Jacob looked up, blinking. Trump held his gaze. You keep climbing that ladder. The boy's lips parted, like he wanted to say something. Maybe a question, maybe just a simple thank you, but instead he just nodded. Not a big nod, just enough. The kind of nod that said, I'll try. The kind of nod that said, I believe you. As the town hall wrapped up, the atmosphere in the room shifted into something indescribable. People lingered. Not because they had to, but because no one wanted to leave. No one wanted to break whatever had just happened. Whatever this moment was. It was too real, too unexpected, too powerful to walk away from just yet. Jacob turned slightly, rubbing his hands together. Then, a gentle touch on his shoulder, he looked up. An older couple stood beside him. The woman, her soft blue eyes still misty with tears, offered him a small, kind smile. Her husband, a sturdy man with silvered hair and a warmth in his expression, gave him a reassuring nod. Hey, kid, the woman said softly. We'd love to buy you dinner. Jacob hesitated, not because he didn't want to go, but because he wasn't used to people offering. Not like this. Not just because. His fingers curled slightly, gripping the hem of his sleeve. And then, for the first time that night, he smiled. Okay. The couple beamed, leading him toward the doors as the hall slowly began to empty. But even as people left, even as the seats were cleared and the echoes of voices faded into the cool night air, one thing was certain. The question of whether God cared about him had been answered. This wasn't just a town hall. It was a moment of truth, faith, and hope. Have you ever faced a moment where you questioned whether you were truly seen, truly cared for? How do you find faith in the hardest times? Share your thoughts in the comments. If you believe in faith, resilience, and the power of one conversation to change a life, hit subscribe now. Don't miss more powerful stories that restore faith in humanity.